Consider This with Carol Schrader is made possible with support from Bass & Associates, First Data Resources, and by Nebraskans for Public Television. Consider This with Carol Schrader, a news and information program recorded on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. From the Fireside Lounge in the Milo Bale Student Center, here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hello and welcome back to UNO. This is a treat today. My guest is a very prolific author. He is an academician. His interests span all kinds of things, and you'll find out about that today. He is Dr. Francis Fukuyama, and he's an eminent political philosopher and foreign policy expert. He's written widely on numerous issues. In fact, I've decided that looking at all the articles and chapters and everything he's written, about as many things as Jimmy Carter had peanuts on his farm. Lots of stuff. He's here at UNO for a very special thing. It's the kickoff lecture for the Dell and Luann Weber Lecture Series, something that is really going to stand out here at the university. And his one of his most recent works, Trust, the Social Virtues and Creation of Prosperity, is sort of the basis for his lectures here today, but I'm sure he answers any questions that has to do with his work. You've been with the RAND Corporation. You've been a delegate on U.S. or Egypt-Israeli talks. I mean, you've been around, and economics, political science. But what interests you most? What makes you really jazzed?
Well, that's a good question. I'm really interested in these questions of culture because I travel around the world a lot, and it always struck me that people will end up in different societies doing things just utterly differently. There's a famous story from World War II where the British captured an entire German radar, brought it across the English Channel, a bunch of commandos, and when the British technicians looked at it, they said, we couldn't create as beautifully machined a radar as this. We had the technology, we know how to do it, but there's something about the German culture of craftsmanship and metalworking that the English just couldn't touch. And it seems to me that that's what really gives texture to life, that the Germans are good at metalworking and the English are good at, whatever they're good at.
And some other kind of theories or ideas you have, but what you're saying is that what a culture, what's intrinsic to a culture, what's developed in a culture, carries over to the broader, the economic picture, and how they carry on and do business with themselves in the world.
No, absolutely, and business really thrives on trust and communications. You don't deal with somebody that you don't trust, and therefore, what a culture does is it gives you a common language, it gives you a common set of signals and a common shared history and set of meanings, and it's just, that's why people tend to deal with people that come from the same culture, so that you have, for example, ethnic enterprise in big cities in the United States. You have Korean grocers and you have Jews or Lebanese or different ethnic groups, and they tend to a lot of times work in little enclaves. My grandfather, in fact, my family came from Japan, and my grandfather owned a hardware store in Little Tokyo in downtown Los Angeles during the 1920s and 30s. And almost all of his customers and suppliers were other Japanese immigrants. And I remember asking my father, well, why, do you deal with just people that are, the same ethnic group? And he says, well, because we can trust them. If I get cheated by a Caucasian merchant, I don't know, how to get restitution or, what to do. But if it's somebody within our community, we have other means of making things right. And I think that, that's a basic truth about economics. If you read an economics textbook, they say it's all, a matter of mathematical formulas and, kind of rational self-interest and so forth. But I think the reality of the economic world is that it's a human, social relationship. Business relationships are built on human social relationships, and those ultimately rest on trust, and you do business with people that you tend to trust. And that explains really quite a lot in our economic life.
And everything, because we
Right.
we are members of our culture, first and foremost, our family, our culture, before we go out into the greater world. And so we tend to, I suppose, model what we do.
Well, trust is important for everything. I mean, it's important for business, but it's important for politics. If you don't trust the government, if you don't trust your fellow citizens...
Well, you can look at the Mideast, you can look at a number of places and see that right off the top.
Oh, and there are many countries around the world where the central problem is not bad politics or anything of that sort. It's really just a lack of trust. People don't trust their government. Officials are corrupt, and people recognize that, and so they don't want to do business with it, and so it can really have very corrosive, or the lack of trust can really have very corrosive effects.
You present it in this book, and you played with the idea of trust in corporations, for example, and you talk about the centralized and decentralized, from the top down, and then sort of spread out. And you talk about sort of the pros and cons and of each, and I'm not going to ask you to explain it all in a nutshell, but the interesting thing is engendering trust in an organization, and that seems to be in this worker shortage and a lot of things that are going on where you can move to the highest bidder, and it seems to be a real key right now in the United States.
No, absolutely, and in fact, I would say that one of the things that's going on in corporate America right now is that firms are moving from low trust to high trust organizations, precisely because good managers understand that trust really greases the flow of information and efficiency within a firm. The classic American auto plant from the early 20th century was an extremely low trust organization. The old Charlie Chaplin movie, Modern Times, where the guy's working on the assembly line and he's just a big cog in this huge industrial machine.
Right.
That, in a sense, was a very low trust kind of form of industrial organization, because all you had to do was follow rules. The managers simply dictated, like an authoritarian government, what the workers had to do, when they could take bathroom breaks and so forth. And the workers basically had to salute and follow those orders like a military organization.
So there wasn't loyalty
and
those
loyalty.
Kinds of things?
And in fact, there wasn't even communication. In a Ford auto plant in the year 1914, 50% of the workers, the blue-collar workers, did not speak English because they were first-generation immigrants, so they couldn't even communicate in the same language that their managers spoke.
Even more barriers.
Right. But today the pattern is really different, and what a lot of corporations are doing is basically delegating authority, because what they've discovered is that if you're going to run an efficient automobile plant, it's the workers themselves that know, let's say they're getting a part from a subcontractor that isn't up to standards. They're the ones that are going to know it, and if they have the power to work, around that or to fix the problem, then the quality of the auto that comes out the door of the factory is going to be much higher.
So Saturn would be sort of an antithesis of that 1920 Ford factory.
If you remember the Saturn commercials, they're very proud of the fact that every worker has a cord at their workstation, and if they see a problem, they pull the cord and the entire assembly line shuts down. Now think
gives
of
you power.
Well, it gives you a tremendous amount of power.
Yeah.
And you think about that in terms of trust. I mean, supposing you did that in a plant where there's a really hostile relationship between the workers and managers. The workers are in a very militant, labor union.
Yeah, if you survived and came out alive, you wouldn't have to worry about trust in the future because you wouldn't be there.
Right, but particularly for that Saturn plant, I mean, every single worker would be pulling the cord all the time, not because they saw a problem in the production process, but because they wanted to sabotage, the output of the plant. And so, it's not a workable system unless there is a really tight set of bonds between the workers and managers, and that's the essence, I think, of a lot of modern corporations, is that they realize that without those kinds of trust relationships, without reciprocity and honesty and things like that, that you can't really coordinate the activities of a modern firm.
The interesting thing is I have, in reading, and I mean, even in the general circulation publications, you sense this quest for this sort of trust. However, there are a lot of things happening in our economy that might throw roadblocks.
Sure.
Even those spikes out on the highway that the cops put out once in a while to stop people, and that's the bigger companies swallowing up the littler companies, buying them for high prices, and then having to, the bottom line becomes more important, and the goals are more short term, and so that, in addition to trying to set trust, is almost offsetting penalties.
No, that's absolutely right, and there's a lot of things in a capitalist economy that really undermine trust, because basically businessmen are interested in the bottom line. They like loyalty, but only up to a point, and when it starts really hurting their profitability, then they show no loyalty at all.
But we had a lot of family-owned businesses, 40, 50, even 30 years ago. And then, the families split it up and they sold it off to companies, and then it gets eaten by the bigger fish. And boy, if you've been there for a while, the trust diminishes with each, oftentimes, with each sort of bite.
Well, this was more common in the early 90s than now, because we've got such a full employment economy. But you had a lot of these big layoffs in AT&T and IBM and so forth. And if you want to look at something that really undermines trust within an organization, just try laying off 40% of the workforce. And in a way, that's the big dilemma that managers face, that they wanted to save money by reducing their workforce, but they also wanted to cultivate trust within the organization, and those two goals weren't compatible. And that led, I think, to something that has been called dumb sizing. It's not downsizing, but it's basically cutting out so much of the meat of your organization that the people that are left are basically too distrustful to take risks or to innovate or to do any of the things that companies need to do. So that managers really have to, when they're thinking about the bottom line, they have to realize it's not just in the headcount in their organization, but it's also in the way that people relate to each other, because if they don't trust one another, they're not going to work together, and that's what it's really all about in an organization.
Well, in our wonderful economy right now, where the Dow and the NASDAQ, I just heard on my way in, they're both up about 100 today, and each company now is almost serving two masters. The customers of the product, for instance, Warren Buffett has a lot of money in Coke, so it's not just the people that drink Diet Coke and all that, but it's the stockholders that need, the stock has to do well for them and pay off every year, plus sell at a high price. So we used to, in the classic business, would serve really one master. I mean, the owner would be served. But the owners are now a lot of people that are expecting a lot, and then you've got customers expecting a lot. And do those...
Well, and furthermore, you've got a global economy where the owner may be some foreign corporation that you've never heard about.
With a different culture.
Right, with a different culture and a different agenda, and it's trying to fit your little company into a global empire that doesn't have anything to do with the needs of your community and so forth. And so all of that, I think, make things much more difficult. But on the other hand, trust is really important in an internet economy. For example, in fact, precisely in an internet economy, let's say you're doing e-commerce. You're asked to buy a very expensive item over the internet from a retailer that you've never heard of, which didn't exist 6 months ago. There's one set of problems. Just do you trust them enough to give them your credit card? But even if you do that, are they really going to meet their delivery schedule? Supposing the product goes wrong, you want to return it, are they going to be around to? And there are all of these issues that I think are at the core of really being able to do business in the new economy, that are basically issues of trust, because you're not going to get customers, and you're certainly not going to get repeat customers unless they have a good confidence that you are who you say you are, that you're going to deliver things on time, that you're going to meet your obligations for service and follow-up and all that sort of thing. And I think that's really the challenge, in a way, of the new economy, because it used to be that you'd meet people face to face, at the kind of corner store, you cement deals over a handshake, but you can't do that with the internet any longer.
And not only that, but many companies, well, there were new starts all the time, and companies coming and going. There were always the sort of long companies that had been around for a while. So if you hadn't developed a trust with someone, you could go to these. And these internet companies pop up. And I have taken the plunge, and I've charged things on the internet. And I figured, well, my trust, is it worth $50? Because at least with a credit card, I'm only liable for 50 bucks or something. If
but
they
would you buy a
steal my name
car?
and identity. Okay, my trust only goes so far.
Right.
So it will be interesting to see if that trust happens. The thing that I find interesting when you talk about trust and the information technology world, the internet being part of that, is people almost put those two things together, that this technology, we will put such faith in it to solve all our problems, that is mistaken for trust.
No, I think that's absolutely right. You get a lot of these information technology gurus that run around acting as if it's the technology itself that creates the trust, and if you just have the right kind of encryption or authentication that you'll solve those problems. But trust is a human social problem. I mean, you trust another person basically if you interact with them over time, if they do things that they promise to do, if they're honest, and it requires building up a record. And furthermore, a lot of it depends on reciprocity. I do you a favor and you do me a favor, and that's something that can only happen between two human beings. It's not something that's created just because you've got a lot of bandwidth and you can communicate. And believe me, you can cheat people just as well over the internet as in person, and we've seen actually a lot of examples now of people using the internet, for penny stock fraud and all sorts of other things. So it's really not the technology at all. The true network is a human social network. It's not the digital network. The digital network just rides on top of the, the human networks.
Yeah, the underlying trust capability. One of the things that, I mean, this internet stuff is just so, I mean, the world is just a buzz with it. I mean, you have to go to into a cave and meditate with some monks or something to get away from talking about it. Is there going to be a cultural clash? I mean, I was just listening to the Pope speaking today. He spoke in English. Granted, he's Polish and then lived in Rome as the Pope. I listened to Yasser Arafat talking. He speaks in English because it's becoming not the, but a universal language, at least in terms of international media. There's a perception in many countries that that's part of the Americanization of the world. Is the internet going to, is it going to create Americanization, or worse, is it going to create a fear of Americanization?
Well, I think it already has. I think there's already a considerable backlash against globalization because it's not just speaking in English, it's the McDonald's
Right.
Hamburger stand that opens on your block, and it's the Baywatch and all the other American cultural
Well, that
products.
they should worry about. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, a lot of countries, feel that American culture is not their culture, and it really hurts the morals of their people and so forth. And those are all, I think, legitimate concerns. And I think that one of the problems with globalization is that many people really regard it as a kind of modern form of American imperialism, where it's American companies doing it, profiting from it. It's American cultural products that come over the net. And so I think that, in a way, there is going to be already the signs of a backlash against that whole process, where people are going to say, look, we want the benefits of globalization, but we want to be able to control that process and take only the parts of it that we are really comfortable with. And that's hard to do because, you can't shut out a lot of those messages. Once you install your satellite TV dish or your internet connection,
You've let
really
Pandora's box is sort of opened.
That's right. And I think in the end, countries that want to try to restrict it are not going to be terribly successful. But but it's a legitimate thing to want to have your own culture and to want to maintain your own community standards for behavior and decency and a lot of other things.
Okay, now this is a kind of a sci-fi question. Okay, let me paint a picture of a world where we used to have where we had trust in our families and the close circles around us, and we had trust somewhat in our government, although we have many examples of people not trusting government. Do you, in a sci-fi kind of scenario, the government is replaced by these corporations because of them being able to imitate these cultural things, get the trust, do you see, we won't end up there where, but where the corporations will sort of supplant governments, especially if boundaries start to fuzz?
Well, I don't think that that's really ever going to happen, because it turns out that there really are a lot of things that that only governments can do and that corporations really can't. I mean, for example, only governments can send aircraft carriers to hotspots in the world. Microsoft may complain about the government and the Justice Department being mean to it in this antitrust suit and so forth. But the moment the Chinese start stealing Microsoft's intellectual property, what do they want? They want, the U.S. Navy, or they want the State Department to, to beat on the Chinese to enforce their intellectual property rights.
However, they haven't always been successful.
Well, they haven't been
that,
successful, but Microsoft doesn't have any aircraft carriers. I mean, it can't do the things that the U.S. government can do to protect its own security, its own property, its own rights, in international courts and this sort of thing. So, I think that the boundary between the government and corporations has shifted over to the corporate side. But I think it's not that boundary is still going to be there. The governments will still be important.
We hear a lot about people working at home with the internet. We hear a lot about, you're able to run the business from anywhere. You've seen the commercials where they go out to a field where there's nothing, and we bought this for $2.32 an acre or whatever. Is that going to change our culture and our trust in the fact that we can go in a bunker anywhere and run a business?
Well, there's two sides of that, I think. First, from a social standpoint, I think that would be a good development. The separation of home and work was entirely a product of the Industrial Revolution. It used to be, in colonial America, they weren't separated. You were on a family farm. You were there with your family the whole day, and you know,
It was more efficient.
it was in that kind of society, you know, that's the way things were. And it's only when you started building offices and factories that all of a sudden you went away and worked in a different place from where you lived. And one of the promises, I think, of information technology is that it can reunite those two domains of home and work and make them whole again. And I think that from the standpoint of children and family life, that's a good thing. The problem, I think, however, is that interaction really requires face-to-face contact, even in, you know, this information society, simply because there are a lot of cues that can only come about if you meet people, if you talk to them, and you know, marvelous as the internet is now, there's a lot of that simply doesn't exist, you know, if you're isolated. And I think in a university, you know, I've spent most of my life either in a university or a research institution, and a lot of ideas only spring up around the water cooler, basically, or with kind of physical contact with
Right, a
people. And so,
synergism between minds that see things differently,
yeah,
or
and it's really accidental. You run into somebody on the way to the snack bar and you say, what are you working on? And it turns out that you've got interests in common and so forth. And that's the part that it's really hard to duplicate, I think, when you're in the middle of your cornfield with your laptop computer, because you may be, you know, technically able to communicate with people, but whether you actually will or not, I think depends more on the, you know, the physical proximity that people have to one another.
when we continue in this ever-shrinking globe that we live on, to have dictatorships. Well, Pakistan and India, you've got two different kinds of government. The military takes over, and next door you have democracy with a lot of people, which has its own problems. But do you see that a democratization because of this technology and trying to build a sense of trust?
Oh, definitely. No, first of all, there's been a lot of progress in democratization over the past century. There are really only a handful, you know, less than 6 true democracies.
Yeah, and
in
it
the year
doesn't happen just
1900.
because it's a great idea. There's usually something else that sort of...
And there are economic forces and social forces, but I think the information revolution has been good for democracy, because a lot of authoritarian rulers and authoritarian organizations, companies, basically kept their hold on power by restricting access to knowledge and information. And the moment that you break that monopoly, you basically give people power. And I think that that's one of the promises of the information revolution, that it allows people to get their own access to information, so that if you've got a corrupt politician running your country, you know, it gives you some information about where the money is going and this sort of thing. And I think that that basically is it's one of the reasons the Soviet Union collapsed, because they were, you know, this preeminently centralized authoritarian dictatorship, and they could not keep up with the needs of a complex modern information society. They couldn't make that step from an industrial to a post-industrial society.
Plus, the people were learning there were other things out there. And the
Sure.
trust, then again, first there was a certain level of trust that the government will take care of us, and it, you talk about trust, it gradually just eroded.
Well, if you look at the collapse of the Berlin Wall, all of these communist dictatorships tried to control people's access to information.
Oh,
but
absolutely.
then after you had détente, people in East Germany had access to West German television, and they could see that people were living better in West Germany.
Not to mention had more genes.
Right, that's right. You know, all those things. And culturally it was a much more appealing society. And so I think it just, you know, in the modern world, it really is very difficult to maintain these national borders that, you know, that are impermeable barriers to ideas, because it's ideas, I think, that travel the most easily now in a globalized society.
What about privacy and trust? I don't think it's science fiction for me to say in another few years it's possible, if certain things aren't done, that someone will know my genetic makeup, all my medical history, everything I own, every communication I've ever had online. I mean, it's possible. Where does privacy, the future of privacy rights and trust fit in?
Well, I think that we are trying to come to terms with the limits of privacy, because obviously the technology itself gives you a lot of opportunities to invade people's privacy in ways that didn't exist before. But on the other hand, I think that in a sense trust requires, in a certain sense, the absence of privacy. You think about a chat room on the internet where you're a 13-year-old, you know, pimply boy, and you pretend that you're actually this sexy 26-year-old bombshell, blonde bombshell. you go under this avatar and you have these conversations with other people being somebody that you're really not. That's not the basis for trust. I mean, trust comes about when other people understand you and your history, and in a sense, the development of trust relationships require that you reveal things about yourself. For example, a doctor that's had, lost several major malpractice cases because he's not competent. You deservedly don't trust a doctor like that, but you can only get to that point of understanding where he really is by having access to that kind of information. And I think conversely, you trust a good doctor because you do have this, this knowledge about their background. So I think people have to, come to some kind of balance and realize that, the really deep social relationships do require a certain kind of revelation about who you are and what your past history is. At the same time that you avoid, these unwanted intrusions into privacy, which are simply the result of marketers wanting to make more money.
Right, but the thing that I find interesting is that when you, when somebody does you wrong, you can identify them, and you can basically narrow it down or identify the person who's done you wrong, and hopefully you won't shoot them, but you don't have to deal with them again. In this information technology world, you could be done wrong all over the place, but you wouldn't necessarily know in terms of privacy who done it.
That's absolutely right.
And so you might end up with a backlash and not trust anybody. I mean, you'll do stuff over it, but you...
I mean, why do people in small towns trust each other? I mean, they live with each other and they don't go away. They can see if somebody's had a history of, cheating other people in the community.
But again, you can see both ways.
You can see both ways. And you're absolutely right that, in a modern technological world where people are physically separated and they're anonymous and people are constantly dealing with new people every day, you can't develop that kind of reputation, or you can't know other people's reputations. And so you have to have some substitute for it. Now, one substitute is a brand name. I mean, a brand name is a form of communicating a sense of trustworthiness.
A whole history.
Right. eBay, for example, has a system of rating, or Amazon. I mean, people, on eBay, they rate people that are selling things, and if anyone has been cheated by somebody that's auctioning something, that's up there on the website. Now, of course, there are ways of getting around that, but it seems to me there are ways of developing trust over the internet.
Well, I trust that we've run out of time, because they're telling me we have. Francis Fukuyama, thanks for joining us today, and thank you for coming to Omaha and to UNO.
Well, thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us.
Consider This with Carol Schrader is made possible with support from Bass & Associates and First Data Resources.